Let me give you a little linguistic quiz. Don't worry, it's not hard. Just take a moment to answer the question. Here we go. This is a wug. Now, there is another one. There are two of them. Fill in the blank. There are two. If you answered that there are two wugs, congratulations, you have successfully internalized a working system of the plural allomorphs in English and are able to generalize to new cases and select the right form, as psycholinguist Jean Berko-Gleason would say. But what does any of this even mean? What is a wug, and why does it prove your skills in choosing plural forms in the English language? A wug is a made-up creature, a pseudo-word or a word with no meaning, represented by this symbol that looks a bit like a bird. The wug was developed for a 1958 study performed by Jean Berko-Gleason, who I will now refer to by her maiden name Berko, the name the study was published under. The purpose of the study was to examine the development of language and language systems in children. Although many real and pseudo-words were used in the study, the wug has become the most popular one, and has become an icon of psycholinguistics around the world, probably owing to its cute little form. It has become so popular that it has an entire merch store dedicated to it, where you can get books, face masks, mugs saying Wug Life, dresses and other clothing with wug patterns, socks, backpacks, pillows, baby bibs, and more. You can even get wug-branded clothes for your dog. Yep. Interestingly, the merch reveals that the wug is blue. The paper was initially published in black and white, which makes the wug one of the rarest colours of real nature and real animals. So, the wug has become popular. The combination of the amazing research Berko did, combined with its cute shape, endearing name, the fact that it was the particular example used in the paper, and the cute little wug test that I gave you at the start of the video, have led to it becoming super popular. But why is the wug actually important? Why do we talk about it approaching 70 years later, especially when psychology and psycholinguistics are fields where we rely on recent research, usually within the past 5 years or 10 if you're stretching it? In this video, I'll discuss what the wug is and why I like it so much. I'll then discuss Berko's original 1958 paper, breaking down the history of the wug and what it is, and then discussing the implications and key takeaways from the study. I'll also discuss some modern updates on the wug through some bizarre copyright scandals. At the end, hopefully we'll all have learned more about psycholinguistics, because boy, some of the linguistics jargon in this paper made me seriously confused, and that's as someone who is interested in linguistics and educated in psychology. So, with that said, let's get into it. Well, as I said previously, the wug is a pseudo-word, or a word with no meaning that was made up by Berko in the process of said 1958 study. The wug was originally designed to replicate new words or nouns that children would encounter as they grow up and grow their vocabulary. In this case, wug sits in the same category as nouns like dog, bird, cow, and so on. The wug was represented in the test by this little drawing that looks a bit like a bird. Side note, the inclusion of drawings when working with children in psychology and in basically any field is super important, since they give the child extra context they might need and puts lower demands on language and verbal communication skills which develop later in life. The use of drawings and other visual stimuli have allowed us to reduce these high-level language barriers, which have in turn allowed us to show that children and babies are far more intelligent and cognitively developed than we give them credit for. But that's a topic for another day. The moral of the story is, this is a wug. It doesn't actually exist, or it didn't until the word gained meaning through the study, and ceased to be a pseudo-word, as many words tend to do. If we have multiple individuals, general English language laws dictate that we now have two, or multiple, wugs. It's been a while since I first heard about the wug, and I can't exactly remember where it was. Was I watching a YouTube video, sitting in a psychology lecture, scrolling on Instagram, I'm unsure since the wug has been discussed in all of those places and I'm up to date on the wug in all of those places. But at the end of the day, in one of these places, I first met the wug. And I was taken away, as many are, by how cute it was, and also how practical it was as a tool for measuring and researching language features in English. Also, the word wug just sounds fun. Now, perhaps I just live in a very weird part of the world, but where I am and with the people I know, almost none of them know what a wug is. The same way none of them know that cockroaches also get performance anxiety. And let's be honest, it's a little devastating that something as cute and important to our linguistic knowledge as the wug is relegated to being known among linguists and certain other niche scientific fields. Because the impact the wug has had is far beyond these fields, and I think it deserves more love. Hence this video where I will talk about the origins of the wug and its importance and implications. And now that I know they exist, wug socks and scarves are 100% going on my Christmas list. Or are they? See part 4 for details. Before we discuss the methods and results of the paper itself, I need to make a few clarifications. First, this paper was published in 1958, as I mentioned earlier. It is an old study, and although I'm not a linguist, I imagine that, although an important finding, it is very outdated in the field. The paper was also a university dissertation, not an actual study done by a group of research graduates. It almost certainly doesn't have the same academic rigor we would expect from modern research papers done by a group of researchers. I'm also unsure if this paper is peer-reviewed or not. Most theses, dissertations, etc. that I'm aware of aren't peer-reviewed, but who knows, maybe this is an exception. Finally, I'm unsure if it's just the version of the paper I was looking at, but the version I looked at had literally 0 references. It also had several structure and reporting issues, which I'll discuss more later, such as not reporting effect sizes. Again, I'm unsure if these were required in the 1950s for linguistics papers, but they are definitely required for 2020 psychology papers, and this just shows why we avoid older papers as much as we can. The research and reporting standards just weren't as high. So with that said, let's discuss the article. It is generally an easy read. However, beware, it also has sections that are just chock-a-block full of linguistics jargon that I don't understand, so I'm unable to explain those in detail. This study begins with a discussion of children and how they learn and create language. The intelligence of children and studies of how they learn and the skills they develop over time have been a focus of psychology for a long time. And we've had a lot of interesting discoveries, such as how children learn word associations, how quickly babies can make race-based generalizations, and how extremely intelligent children are from a very young age. Now, it's common knowledge that babies and children learn things very quickly, but this is knowledge that we have only gained through studies like these ones, and even a few decades ago, the thought that children's psychology was basically exactly the same as adults was very prevalent. Anyway, around the time that this study was done, a big question was whether children learn language by memorizing words they learn, or whether they develop some kind of rules which they can then apply to new words. We can study this by looking at words children already know, and words they don't. If they are clueless about how to say new words, it supports the idea that they memorize words in a word bank. If they can make guesses about words they've never seen before, it is support for the idea that they create rules which they can then apply to new words. We can see this when we teach children to spell out words and sounds of letters when learning to read, and in spelling. Spoiler, I guess. Burko's hypothesis, well, kind of, since she didn't explicitly identify an actual hypothesis in the paper, was that children use generalized and internalized rules which help them learn new language rather than just memorizing words. But how do you see whether children are learning new words? How can you possibly know that a child has never seen a word? In good research, we can't just be pretty sure that because a word is complex, a child hasn't seen it. We need to be 100% certain. And the way that Burko made sure a child hadn't seen a word before, 100%, was that she made up pseudo-words, words without meaning. Wug was one of these, but she included around 27 examples throughout the study, with various other pseudo-words and illustrations to accompany them. Some of my favourite words are tass, heaf, kaz, gling, rick, spow, mot, bod, and more. Burko recruited a group of 12 adults to work as a baseline measure, and ran them through the process of her 27 examples and then a series of compound words. This involved asking a series of fill-in-the-blank questions like the one I asked at the beginning of the video, and measured understanding of rules like plurals, the subset which the Wug is under, possessive nouns, third-person singular verbs, past tense, and comparative and superlative adjectives, and more. These adults were all native English speakers, although some other demographic information was neglected, including things like gender, education level, age, race, socioeconomic background, and whether they were monolingual or multilingual. These adults and their answers to Burko's questions were considered the baseline, or the correct answers. For most of her questions, all of the adults had identical results, which allowed them to be treated as correct responses. For instance, all of them answered that the plural of wug is wugs, and that the past tense of to spow is spowed. Once the adult answers were collected, a group of children, both boys and girls, were taken from 2 college preschools, ages ranging largely between 5 and 7, and they were tested on the 27 items and on their understanding of the meanings of compound words like blackboard. Basically, they were asked questions like, why do you think a blackboard is called a blackboard? And they'd be answering things like, well, because it's a board and it's black. Some commonly known words were included, taken from a list of 1,000 common elementary school words which had been collected from child compositions, conversations, and teaching documents. So what were the results of these studies? Well, first of all, a very fun fact that came out of this study was that the children thought that they were being taught new words, like they were at school, so they would happily repeat words back to the interviewer to show that they understood. They were also, in Burko's words, very happy to and often insistent on giving answers to the questions. Importantly, none of the children didn't understand the questions, at least as far as we know, which shows that enough information was given, and implies that the test was measuring children's use of internal language rules, not measuring their comprehension ability and the ability to understand and execute the task. There was no statistically significant difference in results in accuracy between boys and girls, but there was a significant difference between age groups, as we'd probably expect, where the younger children did worse than the older children. This is, again, an expected result, or at least it is in our modern day, but at the time and in general, it was worth reporting on. This is where some of my issues with the papers come in. Burko reports that there wasn't a statistically significant difference between boys and girls, but there was a statistically significant difference between age groups. This is fine, there was no gender difference, but there was an age difference. But this doesn't tell us much about specific differences. Statistical significance is a value which tells us as statisticians, usually that there is less than a 5% chance that the difference between groups, or our result in general, is normally occurring in the population. This means that when Burko gets a statistically significant result, she means that her analyses show that there was a less than 5% chance that the difference in scores between younger and older children was naturally occurring in the population. As in, there was a less than 5% chance that it's completely random that a 5-year-old and 7-year-old would have a different score. It tells us nothing about how big the effect was. This is where the effect size that I mentioned earlier comes in. Effect size will tell us, well, what the size of the effect was. We use it to see how meaningful results are. Sure, the difference between boys and girls in a maths test score might be statistically significant, but if it was a tiny difference in scores, it's not really important, is it? Even if it was statistically significant. On the other hand, if something is statistically significant and has a very large effect size, we would be wanting to look into it more. It probably means something relatively significant. For instance, if the difference in math scores between boys and girls is very large, it indicates something pretty significant. Whether that significance is because girls are inherently worse or better at maths, because of teaching resources or whatever else, would require further analysis. Burko neglects to provide an effect size for this age difference, so we have no clue if the statistical difference between younger and older children is particularly notable or not. But putting aside my 2020s APA psychology gripes with this 1950s paper, let me mention that the rest of the results section discusses which words were answered most correctly and which weren't. It also discusses in depth and with a lot of linguistic jargon how these vocal inflections, suffixes, etc. are used, and the possible thought processes and rules that children were using and creating as they answered each question. The paper looks at each of the various linguistic and language concepts it analysed, basically the ones I mentioned earlier like plurals, possessives, past tense, etc. The main thing I want to note here is that wug and the plural wugs were one of the highest percentage answered correctly questions, aka one of the questions that was answered correctly by most children. This could be one of the reasons it was used as a demonstration piece on the paper. It was probably one of the easier and simpler questions to understand and answer and is thus a good demonstration of the method of the study. The study concludes by saying that this data, where no children had actual issues understanding and answering the questions, shows that children don't just memorize words, and instead use internalized morphological rules to understand and manipulate new words. It also showed that both boys and girls did equally well, which was important because the study suggests that this was a large debate at the time. Burko suggests that the difference between boys and girls in previous studies could have been the result of cultural differences and language differences. For instance, a child who is around intellectual adults more often would probably be more likely to pick up a larger vocabulary. Burko also mentioned her unfortunate lack of ability to test whether IQ would be a predictor, and provides some speculation on different tasks that were given. But overall, the results of the study supported the view of children creating mental rules for words, rather than just memorizing words as they went. Now that we're at the end of the study, let me mention a few strengths and weaknesses of this article. On the bright side, it is very easy to read, and it goes very in-depth into the linguistic rules that children are creating and how they are applied. It also seems to have a pretty solid methodology, with a lot of similar tasks and different language features to test multiple regions of language development. It also made use of drawings to support written and spoken language, which would have helped children understand the task at hand. This study was also very good in that it filled the gap in the contemporary literature, and provided important results which have gone on to influence our understanding of child psychology and language development, and the teaching of children. The study was also good since it used both adults and children, and was able to contrast their results where needed to show differences in language ability. It also accounted for gender and age differences between the children, and mentioned the key weakness of being unable to test for IQ. But despite its strengths, the study also has several weaknesses. Keep in mind that these weaknesses I mention come from my personal psychological 21st century perspective. I'm unsure if these things weren't included because Burko just didn't provide them or neglected to, or if they weren't included because they weren't required in linguistic studies in the 1950s when she wrote this. So take that all with a grain of salt. First, I've mentioned that she didn't include effect sizes. She also didn't include any statistical test statistics, and did little to no explanation of which statistical tests were used and why, and had a lack of descriptive statistics in general. Burko also didn't identify strengths and weaknesses with her study, outside of mentioning the lack of an IQ test. The mentioning of strengths and weaknesses is important in psychological papers and in papers in general, since it allows both the author and the audience to critically consider the paper and its results, and provides an avenue for future studies. It is also just generally good reflective practice to acknowledge your strengths and weaknesses. Burko's study would also have been improved by increasing the sample size, as she only used 12 adults and around 70 children. Although 70 is a decent sample size, it could still be improved, and this would have improved the statistical power of her analyses. Burko also did not specify routes for future research, which is another good practice of papers, and her methodology could be considered questionable when we consider that it seems that all of the test cards were presented in the same order for every child. This could lead to order effects, where children do better on some questions than others because they already had practice on a similar type of question, not because they actually know that question themselves. A good scientific practice for her to do would be to randomize the order for each child, which would even out and thus minimize the order effect. The paper also includes a lot of speculation as to which specific psychological and linguistic mechanisms could have caused some of these effects. The only issue with this is that none of these claims have any evidence further backing up why she would think them, and none of them are specified as routes for future research, so these claims just seem like random speculation and don't seem to have any scientific basis, which is important in a scientific paper. Finally are some things that I'm unsure were just the original paper or if it could have just been where I viewed the paper. But where I accessed the paper, not only were there literally no references, but I was also unable to find out whether the paper was peer-reviewed or not. I shouldn't have to tell you why you should include references when you're writing a scientific paper, and why, if Burko indeed did not include these references, it's a damning point against the reliability and validity of the paper. But what about being peer-reviewed? Well, if you don't already know, a paper being peer-reviewed means that it has been analysed by several professionals in the field and meets rigorous scientific standards. In psychology, unless we have serious reasons to, and make big announcements about it, we try to avoid non-peer-reviewed papers at all costs, because it isn't confirmed that these papers meet the standards that we require for good scientific research. I would definitely not include this paper in one of my psychology papers unless it was only to reference the concept of the WUG, and I'm not sure that it would pass being peer-reviewed either way since it has all of the issues that I mentioned earlier. But it was also apparently a dissertation rather than an actual paper, and as I said earlier, dissertations don't tend to get peer-reviewed. So with that said, let's mention something that is pretty hilarious about this study. If it hadn't been a WUG that was shown, but instead a gulch or some other nonsense creature in the paper, would we now not have an obsession with WUGs, but an obsession with gulches? The WUG didn't become the face of this paper because it was the cutest or the coolest or the best, although those were factors. It instead became the face of the paper because it was the nonsense word that was presented to the public as an example of the paper's methodology. We could easily have had a linguistic mascot of a gulch or some other random creature from the study. Let me take a moment to showcase some of the other creatures from the study that I love, but which I think were left behind by the fame of the WUG. Unfortunately, the pictures we have of them are mostly very low quality images of the original materials. Like seriously, who wouldn't want the Kra as a linguistics mascot? That thing is super cute. And with that done, let's discuss some key takeaways from this study, why it is important and why it is so important despite its flaws that I am talking about it today, and that it is still talked about and referenced often in linguistics. So what are the key implications of this study? Well, first, it showed that children do have language rules they make in their head, rather than just memorizing every word they hear. Thus, it developed the literature on the development of language in children, and on the application of these rules in the English language, as well as touching on models of language acquisition, which is pretty groundbreaking even despite its faults. The study also provided evidence towards children using more complex language rules rather than less complex ones, as the WUG and other pseudo-words would imply that children generalize and abstract language rules, and that's pretty sophisticated of them. The ability to abstract things especially is quite a high-order skill, and most research tends to point that kids can't express abstraction skills until they're like at least 10 to 12 years old. So the fact that these 5 to 7-year-olds could display it is kind of insane. And this is just one of the many psychological findings that suggests that kids are far more intelligent than we give them credit for, at much younger ages than we give them credit for. This study can also potentially be applied to second languages and other later acquired languages, to see the difference in language learning across age groups and languages. Basically, despite the paper itself not including a segment for future research, it has inadvertently led to a lot of future research. Here are just a few more recent studies that either reference or cite the WUG article. For some reason, a lot of them are about Pokemon. To follow on from the WUG's uses in other languages and education, this knowledge can be used to inform teaching approaches for younger children, and can be used to assess the acquisition of language skills, kind of like a language test. Apparently, this has been applied to other languages, so it's already being used in that way. In general, research around language has implications for education, media, and representations, as well as how we see ourselves in general, since both culture and identity are often heavily tied to language. Language can even be used in archaeological ways, as the way people express language and things like their accents can tell us a lot about their ancestry. So yeah, as much as this paper did have its issues, it still has a lot of positive implications for our knowledge of psychology and linguistics in general, which is probably one of the reasons it is so well known. That and the obvious point, who wouldn't love a cute little WUG? And that kind of became an issue because, yeah, who wouldn't like a cute little WUG? People loved the WUG so much. That it popped up everywhere, and Berko ended up creating an entire merch store for the WUG store. But some people wanted merch that wasn't in the WUG store and created their own, or got tattoos of the WUG, or mentioned the WUG in tweets, or whatever else, and Berko wasn't so keen on that. So that brings us to something that's a bit odd about this situation: the copyright scandals the WUG managed to get its cute little self into. Most of my knowledge about these controversies comes from this amazing and extensive, and brilliantly titled, article by Caitlin Green, written in 2020 in the middle of the biggest drama. The article is incredibly detailed and well written, and provides multiple perspectives on the controversy, but it's also very long, so I'll summarise it for you, although I really do recommend reading it if you're interested in the topic of WUGs and are happy to spend about 35 to 40 minutes doing so. Basically, a linguist podcast called Lingthusiasm started selling, or more like announced, a new merch line featuring the WUG. And Berko wasn't impressed, tweeting this tweet claiming that she had copyright and trademark ownership over the WUG, and thus implying that Lingthusiasm had stolen the WUG or were otherwise violating her copyright. At the end, she directed viewers to the official WUG store that I mentioned earlier. Now, as a media student, I have been taught about media copyright and trademarks, and the differences between them, but I'm definitely not confident enough in my knowledge to describe the difference. If you want more details, Green's article is a great place to start. But in the end, Green uses copyright listings and previous statements by Berko and others to show that the WUG isn't copyrighted, or at least the original drawing of the WUG which was used by Lingthusiasm and the one which is well known isn't copyrighted. Additionally, Berko at the time didn't own a trademark for the WUG either, only a trademark for the phrase WUG life. She had submitted 2 more trademark applications in July 2020, one for the WUG image itself and the other for the phrase "this is a WUG." At the time of Green's article, these applications hadn't been responded to, and I'm unsure where to look at to find out if they have since been passed. But it's safe to say that, at the time, the WUG was neither trademarked nor copyrighted, despite claims on the official WUG store that it is. It seems that Berko has had a history of claiming that she has copyright and trademark ownership over the WUG for quite some time, seeming to rely on people not fact-checking her, and thus just bowing at her feet and the threats of her lawyers. In fact, Green highlights a really interesting Twitter thread which includes examples of people who had received emails from Berko's lawyer for depictions of WUGs. This includes demands to take down images from the internet, and occasional legal threats, or at least the implications of threats. This included fan art of the Wug, fan art being something that very few creators demand to have taken down since it brings attention to them and is usually fair use. Other examples included shutting down Redbubble stores and orders, demanding that school and university clubs changed their Wug-related names and advertising, and even demanding that someone take down posts that showed pictures of their Wug tattoo. Like, how do you reasonably expect someone to not post about their tattoo, or even to not get a tattoo of something that you say is copyrighted? Anyway, needless to say that Berko has, in recent years, been big on being the only owner of the Wug. Beware if you use social media and like the Wug, because if you're salient enough, your fan work, fan club, mention of the Wug merch, or even image of the Wug that is permanently on your skin could be removed. There's a decent chance that this video is taken down because it features the Wug, I think. It later came out that Lingthusiasm had apparently reached out to Berko to ask if they could license the image, and even wanted to take her on their podcast for an interview, but received back an email from her lawyer demanding they take down the one image of the Wug on the creator's blogs, which, as Green points out, is clearly not copyright protected. Basically, the image was fair use. Lingthusiasm then apparently contacted an attorney who found out that the Wug was neither copyrighted nor trademarked, and when the attorney emailed Berko's lawyer, they apparently received an email back from Berko herself, who wanted to proceed with the licensing. Hence, the communication issues continued for quite a while, with Berko's lawyer insisting that the copyright and trademarks did exist, even though they clearly didn't, since she had only recently submitted an application for them. And so it goes on and on and on. There don't seem to be any actual images of the emails, just the account provided by Lingthusiasm, so goodness knows how true that is. In the end, they were told that Berko didn't want to talk to them anymore, and the conversation ended. At this point, it was clear that neither a trademark nor copyright existed, so that was probably why Lingthusiasm went through with the merch anyway, and then Berko decided to expose to the world that they were illegally taking her Wug, when they weren't. Lingthusiasm's announcement of their merch was incredibly thorough. It introduced the merch, explicitly credited Berko, thanked the attorney for helping them figure out the fair use of the image, acknowledged Wug fan art as far back as the 1990s, and showed that they had created their own reproduction image of the Wug, so that anyone could use it. Many people were apparently happy about this, as they didn't like the idea of the phrase Wug life being sold by an old white lady. These commenters were also not convinced with Berko's later claim that her copyright was violated, and her hypocrisy was pointed out as some student clubs were allowed to make money off Wug merch. Green wonders whether these clubs had to give Berko money. This whole situation quickly became a big Twitter event, with even the Linguistics Society of America poking fun at it. Many people were very upset with Berko for being so stingy about the Wug, and revealed her lies, such as initially claiming that Lingthusiasm hadn't asked her to use the Wug, and later claiming that they had, while others were upset that two podcasters were attacking an elderly woman. And of course, there were memes and requests for new mascots for linguistics, since Berko had proved herself to not be the best person. Thus, many a public domain linguistics mascot was created. Many people, such as this teacher, were also incredibly upset that Berko's actions had tainted the wonderful cute image of the Wug. So, to summarise, despite her creation being incredibly well known in academia and having a huge impact on the world of linguistics, Berko has decided that she doesn't want any representations of the Wug, even those by her most die-hard fans who want to keep it with them forever, online. She has been incredibly hypocritical and contradictory, and has lied consistently about the presence of a copyright and trademark when neither existed. In the end, I think it was too much for Lingthusiasm, since there is no Wug merch on their store, and the Wug merch that they had planned is now on the official Wug store for sale. So that was the copyright controversy of the Wug. Berko may look like a sweet old lady, but through these many claims, she has shown herself to be a liar, controlling, and vindictive. Don't just believe what you see. She seems a lot nastier than she initially presents herself, and has apparently allied herself with some questionable people as well. I was going to buy Wug merch because I love the Wug so much, but now I don't want to give her any money. So, to cheer us all up, let's show an assortment of WUG-related memes and pictures and WUG controversy-related posts that Green showcased in her article. I recommend you pause occasionally to really absorb the WUGness of it all. In fact, Googling WUG memes gives a wealth of results that can make someone laugh for days. Academic jokes, my favourite kind of joke. The WUG is a small blue guy who was created by Jean Berko for her 1958 thesis. The pseudo, or fake, word was one of the many which were used as materials in the study to present children with new words and situations. It was used to test language acquisition skills in children, and helps to indicate that children don't just learn words by memorizing everything they hear. They instead create a complex system of language rules in their head, which they can then apply to pseudo-words and in new situations. The paper itself is heavy on the linguistics terminology, but is pretty much what it sounds like. It does have several strengths, but also has many weaknesses. Although how many of them are because I'm looking at it from a 2020 psychology perspective and not a 1950s linguistics perspective is unknown. The WUG study has had huge implications for linguistics in general, and has had such a huge impact that the WUG has become a pseudo-mascot for linguistics, referenced constantly and with many a meme made about it. However, since the release of the paper, like a linguistics-based J.K. Rowling, Berko has tainted the image of this cute little guy by generally not being a great person, lying and sending her lawyers to take down even the smallest uses of the WUG, and using her charity donations and status as a now elderly person as a shield against anyone who would criticize her. In the end, the WUG will probably continue to be a linguistics mascot for a long time, and the study will probably continue to be mentioned for a long time. But just because something was good and/or important doesn't mean we can't look beyond the surface to see the issues with Berko. The WUG has now developed far beyond her initial study. Remember Death of the Author? So now it is owned more by her fans than her herself, both metaphorically and literally. This little guy and all of his friends have a lot of power. But that's the end of today's minisode. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.